Okay, so welcome everyone. We're all thrilled to have you here. Welcome to the Labor Law at a Crossroads panel. This panel we have an esteemed group of faculty who will be talking about the future of the labor law, how we got here, and what are some of the promising ways that we can think through steps forward for the labor movement. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the panelists, and then they'll each speak for 10 minutes. We'll have a moderated conversation, and we'll turn it over to questions from the audience, and we look forward to all of your questions. So briefly, Ben Sachs is the Kesbaum Professor of Labor and Industry and Faculty Director of the Center for Labor and the Just Economy at Harvard Law School. Prior to joining the faculty, he was an Assistant General Counsel at the SEIU and an attorney for Make the Road by Walking in Brooklyn, New York. Professor Sharon Block is a professor of practice at Harvard Law School, where she also serves as the executive director of the Center for Labor and the Just Economy. She previously held senior labor and regulatory policy positions in the Biden and Obama administrations, including at the Department of Labor, National Relations Board, the White House, and the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or BIRO. And Professor Karl Klare practiced with the NLRB and then a union side firm before joining the Northeastern University School of Law faculty in 1977, his base for most of his career. He was active in the critical labor law movement and convened the International Network on Transformative Employment and Labor Law. And Rohan is a professor at Willamette Law.
Helped draft the Federal Job Guarantee Act. I work a lot around MMT, monetary macro issues, things like that.
Yeah, and just a brief intro who I am. I'm an assistant professor of law at BC Law, and I'm currently serving as an expert advisor to the FTC. Before entering the academy, I worked as a union organizer and then a litigator representing workers in human rights and antitrust litigation. Okay, so I'll turn it over to our panelists who get 10 minutes, and we'll start with Professor Sachs.
We'll start with Professor Block.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
I mean, we can switch, but it would be
We've got a thing down here, so. All right. So, so happy to be here and to see so many friends in the room. The title of this panel, I think, is very apt, Labor at a Crossroads. I would say that we might even need a title that conveys even more urgency, like maybe labor getting close to staring at the abyss. I think the best way to understand this moment is through the lens of what's happening with the Starbucks campaign. And we can best do this by looking at what our current labor law is designed to do for workers like Starbucks baristas, what it is actually doing for them, and then what a new labor law could do for them. So what does our current labor law, the National Labor Relations Act, tell us that it's supposed to do for workers like Starbucks baristas? So we're told in section 1 of the statute that the act is supposed to encourage the practice and procedure of collective bargaining and protect the exercise by workers of full freedom of association, self-organization, and designation of representatives of their own choosing for the purpose of negotiating the terms and conditions of their employment or other mutual aid or protection. It's important to understand that the NLRA does not guarantee a particular outcome. It doesn't guarantee workers that they will be represented by a union, or that if they are so represented, that they will secure particular outcomes at the bargaining table. Instead, it guarantees to them a fair process, both for deciding questions of representation and for negotiating with their employers. So thought of in this way, you can say that the NLRA establishes the rule of law for the workplace, just as our Constitution and legal system establish the rule of law for our democracy. So the next question is, how is that working out for the Starbucks baristas? So spoiler alert, not so well. This past week, I had the privilege of testifying at the Senate Health Committee on the Starbucks campaign, where Howard Schultz appeared and answered questions. Well, he sort of answered questions. He more delivered self-serving talking points and misrepresentations of the law. But the important part of the hearing was that the baristas, and more than 200 of them were in the room and to testify, got to speak their truth to power. So what is happening though at Starbucks outside of the Senate? And what does it tell us about labor law? So for the past 18 months or so, there's been an exciting organizing campaign going on in Starbucks stores across the country, as you all probably know. Sorry, it started in Buffalo, New York, and is now spread to successful union elections in almost 40 states. Starbucks Workers United has won more than 350 union elections and has lost very few. So the energy, the independence, the determination of these workers has been remarkable. And the campaign is having reverberations across the labor movement and our politics and public opinion. I don't think it's a coincidence that we've seen unprecedented organizing to other big name retailers like REI, Apple, Trader Joe's. And the theme here is that workers are asking companies that portray themselves to the public as like good guy companies, progressive, cool, caring, to walk the walk when it comes to their workers. But sadly, many of them are failing the test. They're hiring union busting law firms, but workers are still winning many of their elections. So the point of organizing, at least under the NLRA, is to get to a collective bargaining agreement. How many collective bargaining agreements do you think there have been signed in the more than 1 year since the Starbucks union won its first election? Exactly none. Instead, workers have been bombarded with a ferocious anti-union campaign. Stores that have voted for the union have been closed. More than 22 worker union leaders have been fired. Other workers have had their shifts cut, their conversations surveilled, and their livelihoods threatened. And much of the company's anti-union campaign is perfectly legal under current law. But even with all the leeway that provides for employers, Starbucks has still repeatedly crossed the line. Starbucks workers have filed more than 500 unfair labor practice charges in relation to the company's conduct. And already the NLRB or an administrative law judge or 2 district court judges have found merit in more than half of those allegations. So more than 250 violations have found to have merit. The overwhelming majority of the remaining allegations have not yet been dealt with by the board agent. Very few allegations have been dismissed. We will see hundreds more violations found. So I testify that I can't remember another company of any size in recent years that has had this many allegations leveled against it. And already we are sadly seeing that the Starbucks anti-union campaign is having an impact. The rate of workers filing new election petitions has greatly slowed down. But what has all of these findings of violations cost Starbucks so far? Exactly nothing. As you know, when all of this when all of this unlawful activity will finally catch up with Starbucks? Maybe years from now, maybe never. Under the National Labor Relations Act, the remedy for failing to bargain in good faith, as Starbucks has been accused of, and the board actually just this week found merit in those allegations. So the remedy is for the board to tell the scofflaw company to bargain in good faith. Yep, that's it. So why is that? Because the law that is supposed to encourage the practice and procedure of collective bargaining is profoundly broken. We are living in a time of a tight labor market, which enhances worker bargaining power, record public support for unions, and an incredible number of workers starting innovative organizing campaigns in sectors previously thought to be unorganizable. So all of this demonstrates the interest of US workers in finding ways to countervail the power of concentrated wealth and to gain greater control over their lives and livelihoods. But these campaigns also demonstrate the failure of our existing law to translate workers' desire into reality. So to put it bluntly, it just shouldn't be this hard for workers to win organizing campaigns and to convert those wins into tangible gains. That's why even in this moment of hope, when we see workers in motion, there is a great need for new policy ideas to meet the moment. So Ben, you will hear from, I promise, in a minute. And I believe the current reality of unprecedented concentration of wealth and power requires that we develop legal interventions that support countervailing power movements, starting with reforming labor law and then taking the learning from labor law to a broader set of movements. So in January 2020, we released Clean Slate for Worker Power, Building a Just Economy and Democracy. The report was the product of more than a year of intensive engagement with more than 200 stakeholders, including union leaders, workers, advocates, activists, academics, economists, futurists, students, and others from the US and around the world. And it's great to see many of our Clean Slate partners in the room today. The theory of the Clean Slate Project was to come up with recommendations on what a new labor law would look like if it was designed to give workers the power to demand a truly equitable economy and democracy. So the report is over 100 pages long, although we have a handy executive summary on our website if you're interested. At the heart of the recommendations are a few principles. Labor law reform must start with inclusion to ensure that all workers can build power and to address systemic racial and gender oppression. Pathways to worker power must track corporate power and be universal. Democracy at work should be a right, not a fight. We need to enable collective bargaining between unions and industries, not just unions and firms, and to help take wages out of competition by applying resulting agreements to all employers in the sector. Workers should be able to organize without interference from their employers, and workers deserve a voice in the issues that are important to them. So I want to very quickly just dig in a little bit deeper on two of our central recommendations. The first is inclusion. As we heard a little bit yesterday, and as I think most of you probably know, there are big exclusions in the NLRA that were the product of a compromise to secure the votes of racist Southern Democrats in the New Deal. The legacy of those exclusions for agricultural workers or domestic workers are still with us today. So we think we have to start with building an inclusive labor law, which means extending collective bargaining rights to domestic workers, agricultural workers, undocumented workers, and gig workers. We can talk more about what that would actually look like. Second, our other recommendation I just want to flag as really critically important is to move US labor law to a system of sectoral bargaining. They said that takes wages out of competition so that can minimize the theory is at least the impetus for employers to fight to the death to avoid unionization. But there's also increasing evidence that because sectoral bargaining results in higher levels of collective bargaining coverage, it reduces income inequality and racial and gender pay gaps. So I think you could see under this kind of system, our Starbucks baristas would have a very, very different chance at actually getting a collective bargaining agreement that made a meaningful difference in their lives. And you finally be able to get our Schultz to come to a table and treat them fairly. Thanks.
So thanks to the conference organizers for putting on such a great conference. It's amazing to be in a room that feels so much like home. A premise of the Clean Slate Project that Sharon began to sketch is that law can enable social movement organizing by the poor and working class when law is designed to do that. So yesterday, Catherine gave an amazing talk about how law has been and can be used as a tool of repression, a way of disabling working class mobilization. But the premise of the Clean Slate Project is that law has the capacity, when designed in this way, to facilitate social movement organizing. The problem is that enacting laws designed to facilitate social movement organizing generally requires social movement organizations already influential enough to secure that enactment. That is to say that the relationship between law and social movement organizing by the poor and working class is plagued by a kind of chicken and egg problem. Organizing enabling laws may often be needed to facilitate social movements, but social movements are needed to enact organizing enabling laws. So one of the questions for the Clean Slate Project now is one that's faced by social movement organizations generally, and that is what to do when you need law, but you can't get it. One answer, one the project is going to explore, is that you shift jurisdictions from a jurisdiction where you don't have sufficient political power to one where you might. In this case, in this context, the idea is to shift political action from the national legislature to state and local ones. There are a ton of questions involved in this work, both how to do this and whether to do this kinds of questions. And I thought I would take some time just to sketch our preliminary mapping of those questions. There are no answers yet. So on the how side, how to shift the political effort to enact organizing enabling laws from the national legislature to the state and local level. A primary challenge comes from the rules of federal labor law preemption, which are intense. The labor law preemption regime is probably the most robust in federal law. It does an enormous amount to squelch the efforts of state and local actors to innovate in this field. Footnote, but see Glacier, which I'll talk about at the end. So the question is how to deal with preemption if we want to move the effort to enact something like clean slate from the federal to the state and local level. And there are at least 4 approaches that might be taken. The first is to take advantage of exceptions to this robust preemption regime. One is what's called the proprietary exception or the market participant exception. That would be familiar to some of you in the room. The idea there is that when a state or a city acts not as a regulator, but as a participant in the labor market, it is not restricted by the rules of federal preemption. So when Massachusetts Water Resource Authority wanted to dredge Boston Harbor, which was a massive project, it wanted to use union labor to avoid labor disruptions. And the question for the Supreme Court was, could the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority do this, or was it preempted by the federal law? The Supreme Court said no. Why? Because the agency was acting as a market participant, not as a government. So this market participant exception has allowed for some creative and important, although interstitial, actions by state and cities, including the Los Angeles Airport Authority, to facilitate union organizing. The other exception that's critical and touched on by Sharon's comments is that preemption only applies to workers who are covered by the federal statute. So there's a kind of irony here, which is that some of the exclusions that have plagued the federal law that have left workers out from protection actually give states and cities the authority to act on their behalf. So this at the moment includes gig workers like Uber drivers and Lyft drivers, probably. So we had a Seattle ordinance that essentially set up a union organizing law for Uber drivers and Lyft drivers. And the reason that was not preempted by the federal statute was that the Uber drivers were not classified as employees within the meaning of the federal law. So similar statutes might be enacted by states and cities on behalf of gig workers, on behalf of domestic workers, on behalf of agricultural workers, on behalf of workers that are excluded by the federal statute. So one approach to moving the federal labor law reform to the state and city level is to take advantage of the exceptions that do exist to preemption. Another possibility is that the NLRB could do it. The NLRB could empower states by ceding jurisdiction over certain industries to the states through its authority in the section of the statute that's 14C. I'm happy to talk about this as a pet theory of mine, but the idea is that if the board decides that the state is regulating an industry sufficiently to reduce the possibility for labor disruption, such that the labor disruption is unlikely to have a significant impact on interstate commerce, the board can, by administrative action, give a state authority to regulate the industry. So if California, for example, set up a sectoral bargaining law for fast food workers, and the board determined that sectoral bargaining law would reduce labor disruption in the fast food industry, the board could give California the authority to regulate in the industry. It's never done that, but my sense is that it could. All right, the third possibility is to do things that the statute doesn't preempt. What do I mean by that? The statute preempts union organizing and collective bargaining, essentially, state regulation of union organizing and collective bargaining. In an act called the FAST Act for fast food workers in California, the Nail Salon Minimum Standards Council Act, which is pending in New York, the domestic worker law in Seattle, states and cities have set up minimum standards councils populated by representatives from workers, from employers, and from the public to enact through kind of administrative bargaining minimum standards for an industry as a whole. So this is a sectoral approach to standard setting. It involves workers, but it's not quite collective bargaining. It's not quite union organizing. It's collective action, but not probably the kind that the statute covers, and so therefore free for intervention by the state and the city. All right, the fourth approach is the most powerful one and the least likely, and that is just to amend the federal law. Amend the federal law and do preemption reform. That could be done in two basic ways. One would be a kind of floor model where you set the federal law, the federal protection for union organizing and collective bargaining as a floor and allow states to do better but not worse. This is how we do it with the Fair Labor Standards Act and the civil rights laws. It's tricky with labor law because labor law grants rights in both directions. But nonetheless, you could design a preemption reform to let states go up but not down. That strikes me as totally politically implausible. Less politically implausible is to remove the preemptive effect of the federal statute entirely. Why is that less implausible? Because that would let blue states improve protections, but would let red states make things worse. So although I'm not predicting passage of such preemption reform, that kind of approach would give something to both sides. That last idea raises some big and difficult questions about whether preemption reform makes normative sense, and I don't mean to advocate for it here. What are the questions involved in such preemption reform? Well, a big problem is that it would leave workers behind in red states, including in the South, including in markets that are populated disproportionately by workers of color and women. So that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is that the NLRA, for the reason that Sharon outlined, already leaves those workers behind. That the NLRA already disempowers workers and doesn't give them a chance to unionize, doesn't give them the actual right to form and join collective organizations. And that by lifting the preemptive effect of the NLRA, you're not leaving workers behind, you're giving them more of a shot. Okay. Last thing I'll say, I know I'm out of time. Preemption reform ought to be thought about in a politically dynamic way. That is to say, if we had preemption reform that allowed states like California, Michigan, Massachusetts to enact union-friendly reforms, but didn't allow, but at the same time allowed red states to enact union-hostile reforms, what would happen in the long run? And I think it's hard to know, but one possibility is that the union power that was built in states like Massachusetts, California, and Michigan wouldn't be cabined to those states. It could be exported to other states. And the political power of unions that grow up in the supportive environment of a liberalized labor law regime in Massachusetts could be used to move the politics ultimately in red states and then ultimately still at the federal level. So I'll end on that note of optimism and turn it over. We keep Glacier. Glacier is terrible. So Glacier is a case that the Supreme Court has about preemption. And the question is, can an employer sue a union in tort for damages sustained during the course of a strike? The court is likely to say yes. And so I understand this as the institution of the Supreme Court enacting an employer-friendly version of preemption reform. I think it ought to change the way we think about the last set of questions, but I'll leave that. Thank you.
Well, I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you, and I thank the organizers for inviting me on this wonderful panel. For the reasons you heard, labor law needs to fundamentally transform. Sharon Schneider put it very succinctly in his recent article. The NLRA has become is as much a legal graveyard as it is a sanctuary for American unions. Now, I couldn't agree more with the Clean Slate program, and I want to give a shout out to the leadership role that Ben and Sharon played. And if you have not read this, go home this afternoon and download it and read it. It's a fantastically creative platform for thinking about our future. But the truth is, it's going to take a political miracle to enact something like even pieces of Clean Slate or the PRO Act languishing in Congress. So I would just like to add a few lines that stress the fact that we already need to begin thinking now past labor law reform. If we accomplish the Herculean task of getting part of the program laid out, further battles will await us. So transformative labor law thinking must have more distant horizons. The 3 points are, first, we must begin right now to think about the inevitable struggles that will occur over application and enforcement of these reforms should we get to the point of the wonderful day of achieving them. We must not fall into the trap of believing that a legislative victories sets in stone the terms of engagement for a whole generation ahead. The battle of the meaning of labor law continues. Second, beyond that, we need to figure out how to create new institutions and practices of worker power congruent with 21st century forms of work organization, both in the formal and informal sectors of the economy. At least in our part of the world, not necessarily true everywhere else, labor-intensive mass manufacture, which is the iconic image of work organization inspiring the National Labor Relations Act, that model is rapidly disappearing. We need new forms. Finally, we must figure out legal and institutional mechanisms that will empower those who perform unpaid work, the millions who perform unpaid work, and guarantee them a fair share of social product. So I'm going to begin with how did labor law get so bad? And I'll explain why I start there in a minute. One easy answer, it was a limited reform meant to put band-aids on capitalism in the first place. The Wagner Act was not perfect by a long shot, but I think it was incredibly progressive for its time. It was a platform for, and still remains a promising site for transformative projects, for articulating discourses that challenge poverty and inequality and inappropriate hierarchy and domination, and that for projects that seek to nudge our society in the direction of greater equality, democracy, participation, and so on. This is in the legislative history. It sounds like communism now. Senator Wagner said, by permitting labor to organize freely and effectively, we can convert the relation of master and servant into an equal and cooperative partnership, shouldering alike the responsibilities of management and sharing alike the rewards of production. All right. How did labor law get so bad? We can blame Congress. Congress, look at the past 75 years. The 1947 and 1959 amendments moved labor law backwards. We have defeat by filibuster of labor law reform in 1978, of striker replacement legislation in 91 and 93, the Employee Free Choice Act in 2007. The PRO Act is now languishing in Congress. Apart from the 1974 healthcare amendments, which had very important racial and gender significance, labor has failed for 3/4 of a century to achieve even modest labor law reform. Now, much of my early research focused on the courts. From the very beginning, the Supreme Court of the United States is engaged in a project of de-radicalizing the National Labor Relations Act. Its first decision interpreting the act after it was upheld constitutionally, McKay Radio in 1938, gave employers the power to permanently replace economic strikers, taking power, cutting off at the knees the strength of the strike weapon. But I don't want to give the impression that it has been a long downhill march in one direction since 1938. After World War II, in the heyday of the Warren Court and the heyday of industrial pluralism, the Supreme Court built on and expanded the democratic potential of labor law in a quintessentially liberal version of industrial democracy. And in this period, through their strength, workers acquired countervailing power in the workplace. That was not meaningless. Just to take one example, Fiberboard, the Supreme Court found that a company had failed to bargain over outsourcing and ordered the company to reopen part of the plant. But the genius of liberal industrial pluralist labor law project was simultaneously to find ways to expand union power in certain areas while erecting built-in limitation in other areas. So the project completed around 1975. I have a quote here from Justice Brennan, the son of a labor union organizer, and I think he lived to regret having said that. He said the emphasis of labor law in the Boyce Markets case has switched from collective bargaining to administrative techniques for the peaceful resolution of industrial disputes. So in other words, the liberal centrist project, and again, I want to say it was not nothing. It gave workers power, but it was designed to incorporate worker struggles into carefully demarcated boundaries in a essentially state-administered class struggle. By 1981, we get to Justice Blackmun's statement. He says that ignoring the legislative history, Congress had no expectation that the elected union representative would become an equal partner in the running of the business enterprise. Exactly the opposite of what Senator Wagner had said. What's the point of looking back on this history? The point, what my warning, my message is that should we succeed in rewiring labor law, which we must do, not just for the sake of the labor movement, but for the sake of democracy in the United States. That will be the beginning, not the conclusion of the battle. It will then ensue decades of struggle in the courts, struggle in the streets about what the meaning and the contours of labor law reform are. Labor law is it's not monolithic and it doesn't go in one direction. It's a plastic medium, and the struggle for what its content is continues on a day-to-day basis. So we've got to begin now preparing ourselves for those battles. Well, I'll end with 2 points, which I can just touch on, and maybe we can pick them up in the Q&A. We need to figure out ways to create countervailing power under the new 21st century conditions of the organization of work. Modern work organization, the physical workplace is no longer what it was 3/4 of a century ago, an incubator of certain oppositional identities and culture of opposition and struggle. Any labor organizer will tell you that the most important part of organizing is a face-to-face encounter with a co-worker. And we now, with on-demand scheduling, turnover, we don't have the same culture generating those oppositional identities. The jury is out on whether the new online tools and social media can pick up the slack there. There's potential, but risk. So we need new models of worker voice and empowerment. Again, I'm sorry to just end abruptly, but I want to put on the table the importance of remembering labor law deals with the employment relationship. Hundreds of millions of people, and the demographics of it are not, random who these people are, perform unpaid work. And we must, as part of our coalition building, part of our growth, look beyond labor in its traditional sense and find ways that those who perform unpaid labor can have a fair shot at a claim on social product. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks, everybody. This is an intimidating workout panel to find myself on. I'm a kind of monetary macro guy by trade, so I'm kind of wondering what I'm doing here. No, I'm joking. My most recent project actually was on the relative bureaucratization of peak body trade unions in Australia versus the United Kingdom in periods where there was a labour movement in power, labour government in power, dealing with issues of inflation and macroeconomic uncertainty, and kind of looking at why one managed to sort of succeed in keeping a labour government in power while the other unemployment led to the Thatcher regime. So that was where I actually started with my research work, and then I got into all the macro stuff. I've been involved with job guarantee work for a number of years, both through the kind of macro monetary MMT side of things, but also just from working with groups like the National Jobs for All Network. So we got, you can sort of see by my CV, but much less success in actually getting this stuff implemented, but hopefully maybe that's also the green shoots, given that the words I've been hearing so far was like transformation, graveyard, the structural reform. My father was a federal bureaucrat in Australia, and his line was, there's never time to do it right, but there's always time to do it again. So maybe the whole point of today is, what does it look like to do it right, so we stop trying to do it again over and over. I have no idea what the right way to do labor is, but as anyone who's followed me on Twitter knows, I can be pretty salty about the wrong way of doing things. So I think the way that I like to start from this is, what's the bad thing that we all know is definitely bad? And my view on this is similar to Joan Robinson's, which is the only thing worse than being exploited by capitalism is not being exploited by capitalism. The only thing worse than a bad job, bad organizing conditions, are being unemployed entirely, having no work at all, whether that's unpaid work that you're not getting recognized, or simply not being able to get a job because the minute inflation hits, our labor-friendly Fed chair, Jerome Powell, decides that the Nairo theory that he was about to put to bed is the only one he can use to justify dealing with inflation. Suddenly you need to put workers out of work in the name of supply chain issue, disruptions, things like that. So the way I think about this is first and foremost a question of full employment. It's a structural issue. We get to the level of individual factories, we get to the level of individual workers, but we don't do that until we have a theory of what employment is. And from my view, at a very basic level, employment is someone looking for work that they want to get paid money, which means you have to start with the monetary system. You have to start where money comes from, who issues it, who gets paid for what things, and then looking at the question of where private employment and all those kinds of capitalist labor relations that so many people spend so much time talking about. And the way that I think about it is, coming from a country with a decent minimum wage, coming from a country with tripartite labor negotiations, coming from a country where we have a labor party, even when you get that far, you're still not far enough. You're still nowhere near far enough, and the same problems actually that plague the United States plague my country and other countries like it, just at a slightly smaller volume. And the big thing that I think we're all missing is that idea of what a true full employment economy looks like. What Curtis Scott King said, this nation and every other nation has never honestly dealt with the question of a peacetime economy. Because when you have war and you need to make as much stuff as humanly possible, we hire everyone that's available and we work out what all kinds of useful work are and we define it that way. But the minute we stop having that existential threat of the Nazis or whatever else, we go back to thinking that every other kind of labor, other than the most obvious kinds, are disposable, or at least not ones that we need to protect. So a job guarantee in my mind is starting from the idea that unemployment is the scourge. Unemployment is the clear bad that we can all unify around. What it means to have a mixed economy, what it means to have good working conditions, good labor conditions is an ongoing eternal struggle, but that if we can start by eliminating the scourge of unemployment, we can actually have a unifying principle that puts all kinds of labor on the same page. The idea of a socially just labor system, at least in my view, involves sort of decommodification of labor, but that doesn't mean the end of money, and it doesn't mean the end of even getting paid by the hour. It means getting rid of the idea that the only people who create jobs are private employers for profit. And we obviously have all sorts of examples where that's not the case, but when it comes to defining labor struggle, that's usually where we start. And I take a lot of inspiration from people like Buckminster Fuller, who say if you want to build a new reality, you don't fight the existing one, you render it obsolete. So I'm sick of hearing about Howard Schultz because I would like him not to matter at all in the labor struggles that I'm building, which is a world where we have public money going for public jobs for public purpose. That's a closed loop system. That's a system where if we build that, we don't need to worry about the billionaires who are supposedly the job creators because they're not actually holding any leverage over the production system that we are in the process of building. So when I think about what the new reality is, I'm starting public jobs with public money, and I'm looking for the people who are standing in the way of that circuit. So what does a job guarantee look like? Well, as I just said, it isn't private employers controlling the purse strings of jobs. It's creating some system where we can have everybody who wants a good paying job can get one. On one hand, that means dealing with the macroeconomic context. That means people like the Federal Reserve are part of the labor struggle and part of the enemy. It means dealing with the idea that you can have a full employment economy, but unless you actually take that down to the level of an individual person, somebody might fall through the cracks of a healthy labor market. We've talked about full employment in macro contexts as anybody who wants a job can get one, but until you actually enforce that level of individual right, you're dealing with the same question we have with public schools, which is it's very easy to say everyone has a right to a school, but until you're enforcing that in a special education context, a lot of people get left out at the margins. Focusing on not only the worker as a side of struggle, but the macroeconomic system, but also the output. So looking at industrial policy, looking at things like environmental sustainability, and then secondarily in this new day and age, looking at the meta layer, looking at the data that labor generates when you are creating a massive economic system, looking at the intellectual property outputs of workers. Is that owned by the public when it's funded by public money? Is that owned by private individuals? What does it mean to have the output of your labor be remunerated in a system where on one hand you've got widgets being produced, but on the other hand you've got legal rights to the knowledge or the information that gets generated about those widgets? It means situating the labor struggle in a whole range of larger macroeconomic contexts that are often obscured in individual countries. Marx talks about the transition to lower form communism as one moving towards labor certificates, where people get paid for their labor, which is a world in which money has a direct relationship to the labor value that you're creating it. When I think of a job guarantee being paid by public money, I'm thinking of labor certificates first. It means looking at the Keynes-Kaleski question of the political aspects of full employment. Even if you can have more productivity at the macro level, if that means a reduction in the power of the private employer, they're probably going to oppose that to their own long-term detriment. What does it mean to push for full employment over that political objection? That means situating the history of the New Deal, the fact that the Full Employment Act in 1946 was considered the crown jewel and the biggest failure of the New Deal Act, the unresolved or unfinished legacy of the Economic Bill of Rights, the fact that the freedom budget and civil rights movement puts a job guarantee as its first and foremost policy demand. It means the Green New Deal situating a job guarantee at the center of it. There is a straight traditional linkage going from that industrial organizing in the 1800s through the New Deal, through the civil rights movement, through the contemporary Green New Deal. It means looking at international examples, the Swedish example of full employment, in my opinion, being probably the closest that the European labor model got to a sustained full employment, understanding why it failed, understanding why, for example, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme in India is still kind of chugging along, but where its limitations are with 100 days of employment versus a full year-round employment scheme, what it means to try to take that model and apply it in countries that have more developed public infrastructure. Looking at, for example, the work of people like Vicky Schultz, what it means for a feminist conception of formalizing unpaid gendered labor in the employment relationship, and whether or not that's the model that we should be looking versus a kind of decommodification, Kathy Weeks model. It means looking at the legal rights, and to my colleague Raoul, kind of hat tip here, finding in Thurgood Marshall's dissent in Board of Regents State Colleges v. Roth, saying that every citizen who applies for a government job should be entitled to it, unless the government can establish a reason for denying that employment. Maybe taking that one single line and expanding it out to an entire constitutional doctrine. If anyone can do it, I'm sure it's people attending this conference. And it means looking at the political organizing right now. People like Ayanna Presley, whose job guarantee resolution was framed by Indies Times magazine. This is probably my favorite when we released it. Can a federal job guarantee unite the left? It aims to achieve racial, economic, and environmental justice all at once. And starting from that framing of what we're trying to do with the job guarantee. So lastly, very quickly, tensions within the labor movement. I think there is a concern that handing the full employment question over to the state means handing it away from unions. So I think where the labor movement in Europe and other places with established labor parties really kind of reached their limit in supporting an idea of a job guarantee. The idea that jobs are ours to give to our people. We don't want to hand it over to the state. The idea that it's actually harder in places where labor unions are stronger. In that respect, America being, in a pretty rough place with its labor movement, is also an opportunity, not just a detriment. It also, what I call the kind of white collar issue, which is to say, if you're talking about creating the minimum wage, because the minimum wage is effectively zero for everybody who's unemployed. If you're creating a minimum wage based job guarantee, what do you do for those who've had hard-run gains in their own industry so that they don't feel like it's a kind of reversion to a baseline mean? How do you manage to keep a kind of dual structure where you're keeping those individual sectoral gains in place while also trying to raise a bottom tide? And lastly, what does it mean to have things like collective bargaining rights in a public system? How do we go back to the air traffic controller strike and have a conversation about serious jamming of the works of collective infrastructure? So I don't have much of a good answer to that, although I will say, I think the labor leaders, Sarah Nelson, who's been out there working out how to both make material gains on the ground while also supporting this big picture, that idea of kind of thinking about the big things while you do the little things so that the little things go in the right direction. Thanks.
Thank you so much to our panelists for those very broad and helpful outlines for thinking through ways forward. I'm tasked for the next 15 minutes for bringing our panelists in conversation with one another, including our final two panelists with our first two panelists. And so we are at an LPE conference. So before diving into some of the more detailed proposals and challenges to strengthen worker power, I wanted to invite the panelists to reflect on a deeper, more theoretical question that the LPE movement has been struggling to tackle. A question that builds from early utopian socialists through Marxist thought, labor republicanism, Karl work on labor as a fictitious commodity. And it's a question about how empowered work can be when it's tied to the logic of the market and market. And so I just a big question of what informs your vision of true worker power in that context.
Go ahead.
I think the professor of practice up here, I will say that, I think it's important to be in conversation with people who are thinking along that dimension. Again, it's one of the theories of clean slate is it's important to have sort of the North Star and then to think about what are the incremental steps to get to that North Star. We set a North Star that is ambitious, maybe not on the horizon, and that's why we're thinking about the steps to get there. But in how I think about your question is like there's an even further North Star, and that the two don't have to be in tension with each other, but should be in conversation with each other.
Can I respectfully problematize the question? The question suggests that there is a future in which we will not have the market. We'll have something else unstated, how resources will be allocated. And it assumes that there's some structural logic that limits the possibility of any empowerment effects of legal reform. I don't think there is such a thing as the market. I think we fall into a kind of legal formalism if we adopt that approach. Markets are constructed. They're constructed by social practice. They're constructed by background rules. So empowerment could, if the political will be there, I'm not talking about imagining away the political problems, but the background rules could incredibly empower labor. I don't think there's I'm not sure, it's helpful to imagine a day when the commodity form disappears and we enter into some, it's not gonna happen. What's gonna happen is long struggle to change the background rules. To increase the power of the oppressed and constrain the power of the dominant. But to make an uncontroversial statement, let me just throw that out.
I think I have just a slightly different version of that same answer, which is you build power in the context in which you find yourself. And the only way to change the future is to build power today. And that's what this project is about. And I agree with Karl that I don't see a limitation on the political vision or the political possibility that could be achieved by an empowered working class or working class set of institutions. I mean, I will say that I don't think it's just about labor. I think it's, repeat what Karl said, it's about people who don't work, it's about tenants, it's about debtors, it's about students, it's about lots of social movements. But I think that the lessons that we have from labor, both positive and negative, can be informative in thinking about how law can be used to facilitate power building among those different groups. And the way that power is then exercised politically, the vision, it doesn't seem to me is constrained by the law that facilitates its formation. That may actually be controversial.
Yeah, I think when I think of markets, there's obviously this sort of capitalist neoliberal thing that we all think about as our sort of starting point of analysis, but it's also just stuff you buy with money. And if we're talking about having a labor hour being a relevant unit of organization, we can do that too without private employers being the only place that gets to define what that means. So can I think of a world with money? Can I think of a world with a labor hour that's remunerated that has nothing to do with what we normally think of when we think of markets today? Absolutely. And that's probably where I would start. Public schools don't operate necessarily on that logic, or at least they used to. We could go back to that 10 minutes ago. So yeah, thinking about what it means to not have to throw out the whole baby with the bathwater, relitigate some sort of Stalinist top-down conception of an alternative to markets, but just say, yeah, we want to pay people with money to do stuff that's different from the way we're doing now. And if there are certain groups that are in the way of that, we'll just move them out of the way.
If at the appropriate time, I would love to bring the group into that conversation.
And we have a designated moderated conversation, but we can absolutely just put it in. This is, the purpose of this conference is bringing us all together so we can think through these ideas together. So if anyone has any thoughts, please raise your hand, and I'm happy to call on you as we're going through this conversation. And then we can integrate, not have such a strict divide between the moderated conversation and the Q&A. Yeah.
Yeah, so my name is Hafiz. I am an organizer. So I'm working at a worker center for the past 13 years. And the way we try to give worker power and create power to the community is around education. First of all, you have to speak the language that the workers understand. Because, for example, if you go to the doctor's appointment and they tell you everything on the doctor, on the language, this medicine style, you're gonna live not knowing anything, right? So we speak the language that the workers understand, we simplify, and we teach them about the laws and what are their rights and their responsibility. And then they and give voice to the workers. For example, in 2010, we worked to pass the domestic worker bill of rights in Massachusetts. So how we did this, we got a group of domestic workers, we told them, asked them what they want to see in the law. So and they create a list, the thing that they think was important for the protection, they think that was important for them. Then we got an attorney to put in a language that the legislators understand, and then that's how we did. So I think you have to bring the population, whether it's students, workers, or you have to give power and bring them and hear their voice. Because if you just tell them this is going to be good for you, this is not going to work, and we continue to do what we need now.
Thank you. That's such a helpful context for thinking through mechanisms of mobilization that do refer precisely to the kinds of things that the Clean Slate Project has been focusing on, and thinking not just about mobilizing around labor, specific issues, but broader issues that have to do with housing and education and access to healthcare. So thank you so much for that. Anyone have any questions kind of pointing to this? Yeah. Yes.
I'm Shirley from Brooklyn Law School. Wonderful panel. I am so excited to have this brain trust in front of the room thinking through the question that was at Layla that had just raised. And something that I focus on as someone who worked in plaintiff side labor and employment law is the back burner role for Title VII and the identity-based struggles, especially since a lot of the 21st century worker organizing that Karl referred to has been successful because it contests racial hierarchy in corporate firms. And so one of the kind of questions that I'm wrestling with and researching is, in a sense, updating the question from 1982, which is whether work law is public law or private law, and the ways in which the courts have demarcated, of course, these lines in very subliminal ways that are not spoken of those in those terms to workers, but workers just innately recognize that the workplace is a place of public interest, that it is now, since the NLRA and Title VII, an area in which commerce recognizes the importance of alternative economic structures. And so I'm wondering if there is room in Clean Slate and other ways in which we rebuild trust in the organized labor.
I'm not sure if this is totally responsive, but I think it's maybe responsive in part in that and some of that demarcation has been perpetuated because of the narrow range of topics over which, under our current regime, workers have a right to bargain over. It presumes that workers are only interested in wages, hours, and a narrow category of terms and conditions of employment. One thing that we've spent a lot of time thinking about in Clean Slate is how do you can you use the mechanism of collective bargaining to actually give a platform to workers to expand the realm in which they can have agency, and knowing that the corporation sitting on the other side of the bargaining table, especially in the sectoral sense, their domination of workers' lives extends beyond just setting their wages, hours, and terms and conditions of employment to issues like housing and availability of affordable housing, things like that. There have been some experiments. So I think maybe that, I don't know if that's helpful, but I think that's one way in which in Clean Slate we're thinking about making this a broader domain of exercising power.
Yeah, I mean, so Paulie Murray, whose name is now kind of back in vogue for a number of different reasons, wrote a really good piece about sort of racial and gender implications of employment discrimination, 1945, and they have one line in that where they say, but of course, all of this is so much worse when you don't have full employment. All of this is so much worse when you're starting from the fear that you can always be sacked, and therefore, how can you actually argue for this stuff? And I think, you know, there's another line which to this point, I wouldn't say Les, I wouldn't say I would use this to talk to workers directly, but in the econ world, this quote that there's a lot of Harbinger triangles it takes to fill an open gap. The idea being there's all this conversation we have about market inefficiency all day, but if you live in a world of sub-full employment, none of it really matters when you're talking about growth and output. There's this big gaping hole at the center of your analysis. So getting to a point where we're talking about the macro big win, that sort of now inflation is back. We've seen what it looks like to have an aggressive fiscal response to a crisis compared to 2009, right? The idea that sort of we're repoliticizing the Fed going after workers in the name of inflation after 30 years of some, inflationary dynamics. Getting to the point where you can say to people, hey, look, the threat of the sack is the biggest reason that you can't tell your boss to go, I'm swearing this, being polite to the organizers, I would normal to go screw themselves. But then also, to sort of use a cultural reference, the Great War is in climate, right? It doesn't really matter everything else we're doing. The White Walkers are coming, and unless we have a job guarantee-centered Green New Deal, the rest of this labor question is just, building machines to destroy the planet. So I think those are the kinds of things that we can center people around. All this other stuff dissolves in the face of the Great War.
Maybe to bring this into conversation with the panel that we had yesterday, with Diana Reddy's work on union movement, in some ways it's responsive to your question, but also I will maybe turn back to Laura Weinberg's comment at the end of her remarks about the potential for the Supreme Court limiting the exclusive representation of unions, and the kind of erosion of the infrastructure of the National Labor Relations Act to facilitate minority unions, to facilitate potentially any room for other forms of countervailing power institutions that that Please the project is embarking on and thinking through. And so that there's one question there about what are ways that we can liberate forms of self-organization in ways that don't erode the potency of a collectively exercised right. And that kind of the inverse of that is something that I just wanted to make sure we touch on just very briefly here too, because it relates to some of the work that some of the panelists have been working on as well, which is some of the promising ways that we might strengthen worker power outside of the labor law. I'm working at with the antitrust agencies to think through how best to apply the antitrust laws to tackle employer power, including through the FTC's own rulemaking to ban non-competes. Adapting merger policy to challenge corporate consolidation that reduces worker power. And other important efforts. Sharon, you've worked in and with the Biden administration on a range of labor initiatives. What other opportunities has the administration taken to strengthen worker power beyond labor law enforcement? How has or can the administration's whole of government approach and broader industrial policy impact worker power? And I'm thinking specifically of centralized regulatory review on the one hand, but also spending bills that have tied industrial policy to more aggressive labor policy through private labor agreements, higher labor standards, and other mechanisms.
Yeah, that's something that we are hoping to embark on in Slate too. I think there are still sort of open questions about, especially a lot of focus on the current the sort of the current industrial policy experiments like Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS Act. Where are those opportunities to embed worker power structures into the implementation of those statutes? One thing I've been thinking about, and I'm sure there are people in this room who've thought about it more than I have, so would love to talk to anybody, is like what are the accountability mechanisms in overseeing the spending of that money? And is there a structures, is that in? I mean, I think it's really thinking about it from the perspective of the Biden administration's task force on empowering workers in collective bargaining, the game in light of the difficult legislative environment for explicitly building power is looking for where those opportunities are. Fred Seville is here, and that was a great partner in thinking about that and how, whether it's in giving workers more power in reviewing regulations so that that creates an opportunity for leverage. Are there ways to influence implementation of these huge bills and all of this money going out? Like, just where are the places that you, unfortunately, I think it really is in this short-term window of sneaking in opportunities for worker power.
Could I just add one point, that most of our conversation has been at the top level and the very big questions, but and now I'm thinking of the importance of the comment we had about the domestic workers in Massachusetts. We ought also not to lose sight of the creation of worker power, tenant power at the very low micro level. So I think one of the most exciting clean slate proposals is that every workplace should have a workplace monitor, but that we should not have it, that the workplace is a public place. And somebody should be there seeing that the law is being followed, trained and empowered for that purpose, union or no union. I'm now working on a project to put that to have a tenant monitor in rental housing in Massachusetts, and I got that idea. So we again, this doesn't address the crucial top level problems, but it could be a beginning of building power in ways with great potential.
Yeah, I mean, I'll defer to everybody else here on the on the groundwork. I think, when it comes to, for example, the Federal Reserve, the Humphrey-Hawkins Act created a dual mandate for maximum employment and stable prices. And what we're seeing right now is only one of those mandates actually matters. And when the Democratic Party isn't willing to go after the shibboleth of central bank independence, I'm not sure what else is actually going to matter for building a genuine full employment economy, because we hit this inflationary barrier. We're going to be going back to the Volcker era of crushing workers in the name of price stability. And the fact that we've got the renomination of a Republican millionaire banker as the Democratic Party nominee for Fed chair. I mean, if we can't criticize that, what are we going to do? It means to say, hey, that was a betrayal. I'm going to go after central bank independence right now. It could be something that doesn't require any legislative activity. It just requires attacking something the Democratic Party has held as a bastion of its own quote unquote fiscal credibility for a generation. And luckily, Silicon Valley Bank has thrown the Fed's reputation in the dumps. If there's ever a moment to lead into it, I'd say it's now.
Catherine, you have a question. Really?
So mine is going to be a little more in the weeds, and it's talking about how to build worker power at the local level. And I'm particularly concerned that these very high level government things are going to leave undocumented workers entirely out because they're not employees. And we're not going to get immigration reform to address that. So in that context, I'm intrigued by the Massachusetts ride-hailing statute that concedes that app-based drivers are not employees for purposes of state law, not immigration law, but that's a distinction that's confusing to many. In the name of building a framework that we could have now to organize, to really enable organizing of this sector, but it's encountering opposition from people who say, look, the one thing we can't do is give up the claim that for purposes of state law, app-based drivers are employees. And I'm thinking about a framework of how should labor people debate that, because labor people in this room really disagree on it. And what's the framework to at least start at a very local level to resolve these disputes, then try to build power? Thoughts? Back for a question nobody wants to hear.
I don't hear what that's to say, but can I just say an introductory remark on that is that we're not going to have productive conversations about how to bridge that gap without giving each other the benefit of the doubt that what we all want is to empower these workers, and we just may have different opinions about how to get there. But if we spend our time impugning the motives of each other, then it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, we're operating against the background of exclusion and injustice. And the real solution should be that undocumented workers and app-based drivers are treated as employees and entitled to full union rights. And that's what we all believe. I'm, as anybody knows, completely sympathetic to the idea that app-based drivers and undocumented workers ought to be treated as employees, that they are in fact employees, and that we should have Massachusetts enabled to make a better union law for them. that's not the world we're operating in. And I think the question is, what will be better in the long run for app-based drivers, including the undocumented? Is it better in the long run to be treated as employees statutorily within the meaning of state labor law, or to have meaningful collective bargaining rights? And if we have to actually choose, then that's the discussion we need to have. And it's a really hard choice, and it's a suboptimal set of choices. But it's, as you know, it's a live one and a very difficult one.
I'm terrified by the idea that jobs are a scarce resource. I think that's the gateway to fascism around the world. I come from a country of 25 million people that are debating whether we have too many people. We need to close the borders and let people, die in leaky boats, because God forbid that our good labor standards be undermined by immigrants taking our jobs. So I think the full employment job guarantee idea is trying to get past the idea that jobs are some scarce resource that should only be allocated to our people, and that they are in fact an infinite resource, and that the value is coming from the work that's being produced. So that to me is the answer to the big picture answer is, as long as you think of it as us versus them, zero sum thinking about jobs per se, it's going to lead to that sort of fascist, exclusionary, undocumented thing. But if it's, we want more people because we need more work to be done, we've got enough jobs to pay people, then that I think sets a very different foundation.
So I just want to underscore the real tension on the panel and between labor law and Crossroads. And I'd say almost a generational divide. I think our generation formation is very much in a moment of defeat. I think Rohan is not focusing on labor law. He's focusing on labor relations, social relations of production, through the commodification. It's not an answer about organizing power within the liberal market economy. It's about how do you shift to somewhere between a social democracy or whatever democratic socialism means. And I think if we as an LPE movement are thinking of transformative reform as foundational to what it is that we're discussing, then we need to put forward the question of because both Karl and Ben responded to Rohan, and maybe I overread you, and please correct me. As there are real things to be done on the ground, this is, how are you going to get to that? And I think that emphasizing the design of decommodification, partial decommodification, so that you're shifting from power within what is very much of a market economy with full dependence, as you called it, on a job to make money, as opposed to socializing the capacity to do productive and meaningful work in order to include some component of income to pursue your needs. That's transformative. It's not labor law. In this case, it's macroeconomic policy, it's a universal jobs guarantee, but I would be extremely resistant for us to focus purely within accepting, rather than taking the fact that neoliberalism is collapsing. We are in an interregnum, and this is the time to push forward precisely these kinds of things that can change the foundation of what it even means to have a labor relation, rather than focusing on organizing within an inherited market exclusive labor relation.
May I respond? I don't feel any tension with what Rohan is saying. Really, I was thrilled and mesmerized by your presentation. So I think the distinction you're making, Rohan, I'm not sure I see it here. I would disagree on what is a fine, very fine, esoteric, almost ivory tower point. To have the job guarantee, I don't think that decommodifies labor. I think it's wonderful. I support it 1,000%. But to say we should believe in it because it's a deep commodification of labor and breaks with the logic of markets, it is unpersuasive. We should support it for the reasons that Rohan gave. But that's kind of an academic point in a way. I don't think it really affects what we're going to do on the ground tomorrow.
So I really just want to know what generational formation I'm a part of. But I had an answer that was similar to Karl's, which is I don't see the tension. I think that the projects are integral to each other. That is to say, I understand the work that Clean Slate is doing, work that I'm doing also, as figuring out the ways in which law can be harnessed to facilitate power building. And you're not going to get a jobs guarantee without power. And that power has to be built in the context in which we find ourselves today. And so if you endorse Rohan's proposal, you need a theory about how to get there. And it seems to me that a legal theory about what works in that direction is an LPE project.
Well, and once you have, and once you have a job guarantee, any collective power you have is so greatly enhanced. Like you said, there's nothing like a job guarantee to be able to tell your boss to, what did you say?
I don't say go fuck yourself, but now.
To be able to say that, and to be able to say that, and you're sitting at the bargaining table is a really different picture than saying that sitting at a bargaining table, you know, when you were just recently an at-will employee and you don't know where, you know, your union is going to be decertified in a few months. So I think they are very reinforcing.
I was trying to.
At no point was I trying to say that building collective worker power is not important and critical. I was trying to say that focusing on transforming the labor relation and making it from something that is dependent on being able to sell yourself in the market, as opposed to something that is socialized and a collective social responsibility of society socialized through tax system and public jobs, are on different levels of challenge of the inherited market system.
I mean, I think part of this is the decline of the macro as like a positive vision. People feel defeated by it. I spoke to my friends in the Labour Party in Australia, and they're like, we don't think this is good for us. So I'm trying to work out how to get enough wins on the ground and make people who are organizing in Amazon and elsewhere think that this actually is the pathway. And that means having enough power where they feel like they can win, but also making it feel like the job guarantees is part of that. So, yeah.
We unfortunately only have 5 minutes left, so maybe we could do a lightning round, a rapid fire question, so everyone can get their questions in and then we can respond.
Those will be easy to answer.
Choose your favorites.
So this is only to suggest that there's a link between Rohan's idea of sort of job guarantees and labor-based funding and Karl's kind of evocation that somehow the movement needs to take on board so much unwaged care work and other kinds of work. One way, right? One evident way, and is to say that there should be, some combination of job guarantees and basic income that takes the form of remunerating sort of care work, and in that way, sort of, if that becomes part of the Clean Slate, if the macro sort of picture comes back on board Clean Slate, in that form, it will be an organizing tool as well.
I totally agree, Willie. I mean, I don't want to put words in Karl's mouth, but I think and maybe this isn't a problem, and it's not to disagree, but I think that's a commodification of labor, not a decommodification of labor.
It's not a capitalist commodification.
But I mean, this could take a seat in the weeds, but I think the short of it is, right, that remunerating people for social contributions, right, versus a universal basic income, right? is a conversation that, you know, needs to be happening at the same time and in, you know, in tandem or really
Yeah.
enmeshed within this conversation. But I think, you know, is and Rohan both are onto something and, you know, and gently suggest that it is a partial commodification and a way of rebalancing out, right? One way of thinking about it is just how basic income would boost the labor. But perhaps some, you know, an idea with retraction is the idea that sort of that government at various levels with worker participation will sort of administer a system where folks who are performing, you know, care work are entitled to make.
Okay, so we'll just take all the questions. So you and then.
I just quickly want to make a point of fact and then pose a question at this point. It's sort of pregnant, what a lot of people have been saying. But it is not true that political organizing around the child guarantee is not going on right now. Like it is, it's just not in the form of major unions. There are worker organizations and there are unions, as we all know, right? And in fact, historically, it has been a demand of specifically Black and brown workers to have a job guarantee. That is still going on. We had hundreds of groups signed up for Presley's resolution in 2021. It just wasn't the major labor movements. So my question is, when you're thinking about different forms of organizing, do you see irreducible tensions? Because just as in the 70s, we saw the wave of racial justice groups crash against the major unions. And that's why we didn't have major support for a job guarantee, and we still don't. So is there an irreducible tension between unions organizing for the benefit of the workers and embracing macro vision? Like, is this a conversation that is going to be generative, or do I just have to go to the unions and they say no every time for the rest of this?
Yeah, what about a job guarantee at a state level? That is one of the state level referenda, or like state level reforms, and we can maybe even have a referendum, just as a possibility.
First of all, thank you all. This is incredible. My question is on a different topic, so I just want to throw it out there and we can talk about it later. But it's about the concept of countervailing power and what the principle is, such that we know what is countervailing power versus, you know, veiling power. And I say this as someone who's very, you know, traumatized by my time representing teachers unions. But I think where you see organizing around the idea of alternate forms of unions is parents' unions. In the public education context, those are usually being organized by conservatives who think that teacher unions have too much power. And so some of the language around like we should be exporting the scorn to other groups that don't have voice. Like, how do we know who has voice? How do we know who has power? And like, how do we kind of limit the vision of like which other groups need these mechanisms?
Sorry to be that guy because I was in the other panel, so Rohan, I didn't actually hear your talk. However, I just wanted to say in response to the interchange with Yohai, so I completely agree, Ben, with what you said, that, you know, we need to start from where we are. I do think there's a tension. You know, I think the tension arises in the context of private sector unionism all the time, where private sector unions end up making alliances with capital around particular projects. And I think that you know, it'd be a good problem to have right now if we were confronting, you know, those types of alliances and having to figure out a political strategy that actually sort of, you know, moves labor in more of a social democratic direction in the US. But I think that tension, you know, is working there. At least that's a place where I see it.
Thank you all so much for this panel. I wanted to offer a perspectival shift that I think has come from talking to workers for a living. And they've chided me on this, so I want to offer it here. Sarah Nelson was mentioned. Sarah actually chided me about this on an interview where she said, stop saying give workers power. They already have it. The question is how to unleash that, right? And I think that that's actually an important way to think about this, right? Because we all know the shit show on the nation's railroads, right? I was interviewing railroad workers for the past year and a half, and you can see Sarah's principle in their struggles because the Railway Labor Act, not the NLRA, is an entire Rube Goldberg system designed to neutralize the power that railroad workers demonstrated they had by bringing the economy to its knees a century ago. And so I think it's really interesting to consider how the work that y'all are doing on the legal side can help workers unleash the power that they already have through collective forms of organization. One on the ground example I would give from 2 weeks ago is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, right? I think they're a bellwether of this, right? They do not have the same legal protections, the capabilities to unionize. A lot of them are undocumented, hyper exploited. They were marching because a group of workers from Central America were living in slave conditions in Ron DeSantis' Florida, right? So what they do is they band together and they march on companies. And they say, you need to sign this document saying that you will not source from growers who are known to be abusive to their workers. That's not necessarily a union, but as Rebecca Gibbon at Rutgers would say, you don't need to be in a union to act like it. So I think the question I would ask is like, how can the legal side of the movement help with those efforts?
One quick, but those workers for March, they're hiring and they're looking for a general counsel anyway. Asked me to tell it, so great, this is great, they're looking for a general counsel, it's on their website, if anybody's knows anybody. You know, I'll punch them.
Full employment for labor lawyers.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, thank you so much. We are unfortunately at time, but I just wanted to make sure that we, thank our panelists and we're all available at the conference to continue this conversation. But this is just a really helpful way of crystallizing some of the core tensions that we're facing, and I look forward to using the rest of the conference to kind of work them through.